Hello friends, in this lecture we're going to create the player class and the blueprint and also the game mode. Okay, so first of all, let's go ahead and create a new C++ class for the player character. This time we're not going to inherit from the pawn like we did in the first two games. We're going to inherit from a class called PaperZD character. This one. As you can see, it's inheriting from paper character, and that's inheriting from character itself. That means this is going to have a character movement component, and we're going to use that to implement all the movement for the player. So this time we're not going to create our own custom stuff, we're simply going to use Unreal's built-in movement logic. It's actually going to make things easier for us, so that's a good thing. Secondly, the PaperZD character is going to have an animation component, and that's going to allow us to use the animation capabilities of PaperZD. We're going to learn all about it very soon. It's going to make things very easy for us. So let's go ahead and click on next. The name for this is going to be player character, and then we're going to create it. So here is the class that was just created for us, and as you can see, it's completely empty. There's nothing inside of here. But because we're inheriting from PaperZD character, a certain set of components are going to be created for us out of the box. We don't need to declare them here or create them inside of the constructor. Those are going to be the capsule component, the flipbook component, an animation component, and also the character movement component. So we're going to get those out of the box, and as an addition, we're going to create a spring arm here and also the camera. We're also going to create the functions that we're going to use, like begin play, tick, and the constructor, because we also didn't get them here, as you can tell. So let's create a public statement here. And first of all, let's create those functions. So the constructor is going to be a player character, just like that. Begin play is going to be virtual void, begin play, override. And then tick is going to be virtual void, tick. This will take in the delta time, and also override. Just like that, let's also create the components. For these, we're gonna have to include some files up here. The first one is going to be for the camera, which is going to be camera components.h. The second one is going to be the spring arm, and that is going to be game framework. Spring arm components.h. Let's also declare them here. We're going to use a uProperty visible anywhere for these. We'll make them blueprint read write. The first one is going to be the spring arm. So let's say uSpring arm component pointer, spring arm. And then we'll create the camera, which is going to be uCamera component pointer camera. Just like that, awesome. Let's create the functions. So I'm going to copy and paste these into the C++ file. Get rid of these virtuals. Also the override, create the function bodies. And finally, let's also paste the class name. Just like that. And for begin play and tick, we're also going to make a call to super begin play, and also super tick, pass in the delta time, just like that. And inside of the constructor, we're going to say primary actor tick, b can ever tick true, so that this actor can actually call the tick function, which is going to be important for us. Next up, we're going to create these components here inside of the constructor, and that's going to be all we do in code. So let's go ahead and say spring arm equals create default sub object, use spring arm component, and then the name is going to be spring arm. And then we're going to attach this. So we'll call setup attachment to the root component. This time, because we're inheriting from PaperZD character, we don't have to create the root component ourselves. That's going to be created and assigned, so we can just simply use it here. Next up, we're going to create the camera. So we'll say camera. This will be uCamera component. The name will be camera as well. And then we're going to attach this, set up attachment to the spring arm. And we're going to use the uSpringArm component socket name for the socket, because this is how we do it for attaching the camera to the spring arm. We did the same thing for the Desert Racer game as well. It's just the same setup. Okay, like I said, this is going to be all we do in the code for the player. So let's go ahead and go into Unreal, exit, and then we're going to rebuild the project. After that, we're going to create a blueprint for the player, and also we're going to create the game mode. Now let's go ahead and create a blueprint from the player class. I'm going to create a new folder here. We're going to call this blueprints. Inside of blueprints, we're going to create another folder called characters. In here, we're going to create a new blueprint class, and we're going to do a search for player character. Right here, as you can see, we're inheriting from PaperZD character. Awesome. We're going to call this blueprint underscore player character. Let's open it up. And as you can see in here, we have a capsule component as the root. There's an arrow component here for some reason. There's a flipbook component called sprite. So this is interesting. They decided to call the flipbook component sprite. So this isn't a sprite. Like I said, it's a flipbook component. Then we have the spring arm and the camera we created ourselves. And at the end here, we have an animation component, which is something PaperZD introduces. And also a character movement component, which is Unreal's component that handles movement logic. We're not going to touch these in this lecture. We're going to configure them later on. So let's just go ahead and configure the flipbook, the capsule, and also the spring arm and the camera. So let's start with the flipbook. The default flipbook we're going to use is going to be idle. Let's pick that. It's going to look like this. We're going to use the translucent, unlit sprite material for this. Let's scroll down and turn off the collision. So the preset is going to be no collision. And then finally, we'll take a look at rendering and make sure we are at something other than 0. So for the player, I think I'll just say 100 because the player should be in front of most things. So that's going to be the flipbook. Next up, we're going to configure the spring arm and the camera. We're going to rotate the spring arm by -90 degrees so that the camera is looking at the player. And we're also going to turn off do collision test because we don't want the spring arm to do any kind of collision at all. That's going to be all basically for the spring arm. And then we're going to switch to the camera. The camera is going to be orthographic and the width is going to be 1024, nice and wide. Besides that, we don't really need to do much. We will go ahead and set the scale to be 0.01 so that we don't see the camera. And that should be all for the camera. Finally, here we're going to set up the capsule components. So let's switch to the right viewing angle and go into the capsule. Let's reduce the radius to be like 14. And then we'll reduce the height to be something like 24, just like that. And that should be good enough. We can change it later on if we don't like it. Let's save this, compile, and now we're going to create a game mode. This time the game mode isn't going to be a C++ class, it's just going to be a blueprint, and creating the game mode is going to be your challenge. So go ahead and create a game mode blueprint. So the blueprint you create is going to inherit from game mode base. Then I want you to set the player blueprint that we just created as the default pawn. And then we're going to set this game mode blueprint as the default in the project settings. And finally, I want you to add a player start to the level and then test the game. So nothing complicated there, give it a shot and come back when you're done. So first of all, we're gonna go ahead and create a new folder inside of the blueprints folder. If you didn't do this, that's fine, you can just do it and then move the game mode blueprint into this new folder. We're going to call it other. In here, we're going to create a new blueprint class. We're going to inherit from game mode base, and we're going to call this blueprint Krusty Pirate game mode. If you called it something else, that's just completely fine. You don't need to change it. We're going to open this up. And in here, we're not going to do much. We're simply going to change the default pawn to be blueprint player character. Let's save this, compile it, and now we're going to go into the project settings, go into maps and modes, and set the default game mode to be Blueprint Krusty Pirate game mode. Awesome, now this Blueprint game mode should be used as the default. As the last step, we're going to go into the level, create a player start. So let's bring that in. Let's make sure the Y position is 0, it is, perfect. And now we're going to test the game. And as you can see, now we have a player inside of the game. I'm going to press F8 and eject because I think the player is kind of floating in the air. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the player from the outliner here. We're going to click on the sprite and we're going to move it down a little just to see how much we need to move it down so that it touches the ground. So it seems like -2 is the correct number, but changing it here is not going to be enough. We actually need to go into the blueprint. So let's go into the blueprint. Let's click on the sprite or the flipbook and let's move it down by -2. And now we're going to save that, compile it and test this again. And now as you can see, the player is actually touching the floor. Perfect. So that's all we're going to do in this lecture. As a recap, we created a new C++ class that's inheriting from PaperZD character. In here, we created two components, the spring arm and the camera. We also created these default functions we always use. And then inside of Unreal, we created a blueprint from this player character class. We configured the flipbook, spring arm and the camera, and also the capsule. And finally, we created a game mode, set the player as the default pawn, set the game mode as the default game mode, and finally created a player start inside of the level.